Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews, a writer, bookseller, collector, quite tired bookseller, busy at the moment with the C word season, obviously in retailing. Things are full on now, books make great gifts, so I thought I'd do this now. This isn't about the best books published this year, because of course if you spend all your time reading new books, you miss the great books of the past. You have to be selective. So this is an entirely subjective list, looking back at what I've read over the years. And I'm going to talk to you about some things I've enjoyed, and I'll leave probably the best for last. It's not ranked or anything like that. A lot of these books I've covered on the channel, either on the main body of the channel or in the members area, which I call the club room. Membership to the club room is still $4.99 a month. You get an exclusive video every week. The membership has gone up and up and up, and that's going to continue. And also there's like a backlist of about 50 videos there to watch, and you will have noticed if you follow the channel closely that from September I started releasing the odd video from a year ago. So some of them will make their way into the main body of the channel, but some of them will stay in the club room. So that's what's been happening. Quick channel overview. At the beginning of the year there were 10,000 subscribers. At the moment it's something like 16,300. It grew a lot after I posted the video entitled The Ultimate Philosophical Science Fiction Novel, about my favourite modern novel per se, The Glamour by Christopher Priest. And you know, this year the channel has sort of been more successful again, even though I have not consciously, partially consciously, but I just have drifted away from genre SF quite a lot because I've grown frustrated with it, as I do every few years. So watch closely, because next year, who knows where the channel will go. Will there be a resurgence of genre SF? We'll see. But it's all about you. I want to thank members, particularly in the club room. They've really helped keep things going, because without that membership support, I would have quit by now, because as you'll know, again, if you follow the channel closely for some time, I've been ill since September 2023. I am seeing some real changes in the last month and a half, so if I can get through Christmas, I'm hoping that by next spring I'll be back to normal. And thanks to everybody who has sort of sent good wishes and warm vibes and what have you my way. So let's get into it. The start of the year was pretty rough for me. I fell over and broke my wrist. That was coming after 2 colds, which weren't particularly great, and it really sort of wasn't a fantastic start. But in the early part of the year, I did a lot of collecting. If you look back at the channel, you'll see me doing a lot of collecting, sort of book hauls and what have you. Quite a few of those are now in the club room. Most of the book hauls and the individual book reviews are in the club room, but there are still some on the main body of the channel, of course. So I was largely distracted by collecting rather than reading in the first sort of 4 or 5 months of the year. Also, I was spending more of my free time on listening to music. I will talk about a couple of music books later on, and I read a lot of non-fiction. This will primarily cover the fiction I read. I do mention some of the non-fiction I read on the channel, but it's primarily going to be the fiction. So before we go any further, absent friends, it's not been a great year for genre SF. One of the worst things that happened as far as I was concerned was the untimely death of Chelsea Quinn Yarbro. This is Chelsea Quinn Yarbro's False Dawn, one of the easiest Yarbro books to find. Arguably her best pure SF novel. It's a savage and unremitting but very humane post-apocalyptic novel. It's comparable to things like The Road and Earth Abides. Really great book. She wrote about 100 books, had about 6 pseudonyms. She's mostly known for her 30-plus book series, the Saint Germain Chronicles, which are historical horror novels about an immortal vampire who is more of a humanist than most vampires you'll come across in fiction. I've read all of them. They're magnificent. She lost her deal with Tor about 2017. At least 3 books in the sequence remain unpublished. Hopefully they will happen. And what a great shame, you know, Tor turned more and more and more to this sort of absolutely dreadful books which most mainstream publishers are publishing now, and a real artist gets pushed to one side. It is about sales, unfortunately, but she's been horribly neglected, so do try and pick this up. She really is quite something. I did a video about her work in the very early days of the channel. There will be a full-blown one next year. I haven't got around to it yet because I'm still processing her death, and I want to think about what I want to say in a bit more depth, but great stuff. I also read a non-fiction book by her under her pseudonym TCFH Hopkins, which was about a military battle way back in the 16th century, so I'm not going to cover that on the channel here. But watch out for this. It's quite common in Britain in paperback secondhand. See if you can get hold of it. It's a great book. Anyway, what else? Somebody I reconnected with through their work. I didn't reconnect with them personally, though. He and I used to interact for a while on social media. I must try and get back in touch with him. Is the very wonderful Mark Laidlaw. And this is probably Mark's best known book. Mark sort of came up in the 80s, round about the time of cyberpunk. This is Dad's Nuke, which is a very satirical book about a typical dad who's got a nuclear weapon in his back garden, and he would make a wonderful TV series. It really, really would. So it's a sort of Vonnegut type school, but with that sheeny cyberpunk feel. And even though I haven't reread this for years, I finally got round to reading this book from the early 90s, The Orchid Eater, which you could say is a thriller, is set in a very gritty California location, and it's really about young men going adrift and a kind of gang war in a way. And it took me back to those days when the people who came up through cyberpunk often took a left turn into general fiction, like Lewis Shiner, for example, who produced the wonderful Slam, a book about skate punks. And it was just a great time because these guys were getting across this really sort of gritty, urban, noir-y thing, especially in California. And I really enjoyed this. It's not front rank, it's not a masterpiece, but it was a very enjoyable read. If you're looking out for Mark's books, I really recommend a book called White Spawn, which was published as a limited edition PS novella, probably about 10-15 years ago. It's quite short, and it begins with this amazing kinetic opening about a guy driving a van through a river valley. And I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but it's a wonderful piece of writing, and it goes on to become a very, very interesting weird fiction novella. So Mark Laidlaw, worth watching out for. Somebody else from those sort of days started his career in the 70s with some very ornate, floral, strange SF novels set on other planets with implications of anthropology in them. He was kind of a cross between Robert Holdstock and Ian Watson because he was American. It's the very wonderful Michael Bishop. Bishop moved on in the 80s to become probably the leading humanist SF writer of those years, and he died last year. Great shame. We never met. We interacted a few times over social media and emails. He was a heck of a nice guy, and he did have some pain in his life. He passed away, as I say, and I hadn't read him for ages, and I'd had this one aside for a while. It's just from the 90s, Count Geiger's Blues, which is about an art critic in an alternate America in an interesting city who inadvertently becomes a superhero, and he has to learn to champion low culture. He has an interesting relationship with his nephew, the Mick, who's a bit of a punk rocker on the side. And it's really, really funny and warm and human, and I laughed several times. There is a full-blown review of this on the channel, really good. I'm looking forward to reading more Michael's books next year because I've got a few I haven't read, and there's some I need to go back to. That's something I haven't done much this year. A lot of my favourite writers I haven't read this year. I haven't read anything by Thomas M. Dish this year, and that's incredible because I've got 4 or 5 books by Dish, later ones I haven't read yet, so that will happen. So it shows how off kilter I've been with things. Quite interesting, really. A quick aside, Carter Schultz's Gypsy, which is here in the PM Press Outspoken Authors series. Carter Schultz is best known for a book called Palimpsest, which was a Ace special back in the 80s, which divides people. Barry Ann Malmsberg loved it, and that was good enough for me. Gypsy is a novella. It has some short stories in it, and you know, if you want something which is genre SF but which is messing with it in terms of a literary approach and doing unusual things, you know, if you like people like Malmsberg, then I'd really recommend Gypsy. It was great. There is a review of it on the channel, as I say, somewhere. I can't remember exactly where, but that was good. I actually enjoyed that. Something I mentioned, it might have been in the club room a while ago. This is a reissue. This is a book which first came out in 2020. I think it was written in 2016. It was a Danish book, and it's had a bit more attention recently. And I bought this because I had the first edition, which was a plain black paper, and I didn't really like it, and I moved it on. This is the recent reissue of The Employees by Olga Ravn, and this is a Slipstream SF novel about a generation starship, but it's not quite a generation starship, and it's comprised of interviews between people who work on board this starship with a slightly unspecified colonial mission, and they land on this planet and they discover some strange artifacts, the objects they're called. So it's told in a polyphonic manner, lots of different voices. There is a full-blown review of it in the club room. This is in the shops now, and she has just had a new book out, which I think I don't know if I'm going to read it or not. I probably will wait for the paperback. But she is somebody who is like a star in waiting. She may be too avant-garde for the average taste, but if you're interested in Generation Starship and Colonial Starship narratives, my friend James Wright wrote a book called Skinship, which I don't have to hand. I've got it here somewhere in a box. There's a review of it around about a year ago on the channel, and it's worth comparing it to that. But if you want to go out there on the edge of the avant-garde, give that a try. It's very interesting. I enjoyed it more the second time around than I did the first time, which I think says a lot, really. Something I did is a bit of a reading project, and I don't really set myself these reading projects because I know I won't stick to them. I'm too mercurial as a reader. I don't like to have a planned TBR because I know I'll DNF it. So it was a reread of the Book of the New Sun, because I wanted to sort of move on to the other parts of the sequence, which I haven't read. And I've always had ambiguous feelings about the Book of the New Sun. So I made a video a few months back called Shall We Burn the Book of the New Sun, which of course was ironic and rhetorical. One of my long-term viewers, I think, quit the channel after that. I hope nothing's happened to him. Daniel, if you're out there and watching, I hope you're okay. So I reread the Book of the New Sun. This, of course, is The Claw of the Conciliator. This is the UK first edition with the Bruce Pennington cover. I just thought I'd show that one because whenever I talk about the Book of the New Sun, I always flash up Shadow of the Torturer. And it was interesting to reread this again. And I still feel Gene Wolfe is a mixture of the brilliant and the Emperor's New Clothes. But if you want to see that video, go back to it. But there are moments which are just marvellous. And it is a book which you do have to reread. And it's worth rereading. I just wish it was a little bit shorter. But yeah, if you've not read the Book of the New Sun, you kind of got to do it. But what I would say is don't feel you have to say it's good, because there is a kind of reverence around it. But I want to read more Wolfe next year because I've collected quite a bit this year of books by him I haven't read. So I'm looking forward to trying some of the later things that I'm less familiar with. Somebody who I had read before, and I read a couple of books by him and made at least 2 videos, one in the club room and one on the main part of the channel, is the Welsh SF writer Peter Tate. This is Gardens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the States, it's called Gardens 1 to 5. It's 1-5, I think. And this was published way back in the 60s. This is Faber, and he used to pop up in New Worlds. And he's a very interesting writer. Of the 2 books I read this year, the more memorable one was Green Coma, which I covered on the main body of the channel. The review of this is in the club room, I believe. And it's really interesting looking back at the new wave writers of the 60s, because their main thing was to try modernist literary techniques and to try unusual things. They didn't always succeed. Some of it really hasn't, I wouldn't say it hasn't aged well. Some of it wasn't great at the time. Some of it was absolutely brilliant. The works of people like Michael Morcock, M. John Harrison, J.G. Ballard, Langdon Jones, immaculate stuff. Tate is a more minor writer. Because I'm Welsh and he's Welsh, I was really interested. This is not as good as his best novel, which I would say is the one with Poison Rain in the title, which is fantastic near future political novel. But this was really good, really unusual. So if you see any of Peter Tate's books, pick them up, watch the videos. They're worth looking at. So this was a curio and I enjoyed it. What I didn't enjoy so much was I went back to the work of Doris Passerchia and I read one of her books earlier this year, and I've now read 4 or 5 of them. And she's always original and ornate and strange and in very, very interesting world building and biological approaches. But she does seem to write the same book over and over again. She's no longer with us, of course. And her writing was one of the things which pushed me away from genre SF this year. There's basically one of the problems with genre SF is that there's always been a lot of bad writing in it. There's a lot of bad writing out there in the mainstream. But to get really great science fiction, once you get past a certain date, once you get the 60s, really your expectations should go up. And a major problem now is that in terms of genre SF books published, packaged and marketed as science fiction, there isn't a lot of great literary stuff going on. And that was reflected in the poor showing this year. We've had nothing new from Adam Roberts this year, which is unusual. Adam has a new book out next year, Frankenstein Rex, so I'm looking forward to that, but the publication date keeps moving backwards. I'm sure that'll be fantastic. There hasn't been a new book from M. John Harrison. Of course, he doesn't produce one annually. There is a new one coming next year, which I'm really looking forward to, and that'll be featured heavily on the channel. Christopher Priest is dead, of course, sadly. And, you know, Dave Hutchinson has a new book, which is out any time. I've got it on pre-order, so I can't show it to you yet. I know that I and also John at Sci-Fi Scavenger are both really looking forward to that. It'd be nice to have a new Dave Hutchinson, because it's been a while, and it's a novella, which is a length which suits me really well. So it's not been a great year for genre SF, and for literary genre SF particularly. In fact, that way it's been a really bad year. But we'll come more on to that as we get to the best books I've read this year. Taking a tangent, a while ago I shot an interview with Jude Alec Owen, the author of this book, Death's Litany, which is book 1 of the Black Watch, which is a self-published fantasy trilogy. Now, before you start sending me emails wanting to send me your book to review it and to cover it, what have you, don't. The other day, I went into my Outlaw Bookseller email, and I had 4 emails in the same day from people, and very often they're spam emails, you know, they've gone to a lot of people. Sometimes they're individually curated and written for me, and they say, really like your channel, you know, I'd just like you to send my book. I don't particularly want you to review it, just to let you have it. The fact is, I don't read self-published novels. End of. Usually because, as I've worked in the book trade for a very long time, I've been approached by people self-publishing for 40 years. And the first thing I do when I read a self-published novel is I pick it up and I start reading it, and I start looking for bad writing. And usually I find it before I'm at the bottom of the page. That's the way it goes. However, at the moment, there is an issue with a lot of more traditional SF and fantasy is not getting past the sensitivity readers. It's not getting published. The budgets for science fiction and fantasy are increasingly going towards fantasy in mainstream publishing terms, and they're going mostly to romantasy. So it's very hard to get traditional SF published now. So I can see why people are going that way. And of course, if they want to tackle topics which are considered not woke, more on that in the last video, then they're not really able to do that. And science fiction is what if. You should be able to do that. But the exception to the rule, because I know Jude, I decided to interview him on camera about his experiences in trying to get his book published. I've not read it yet. He sent me a copy the other day at last. So if you are interested, I say I haven't read. I've read a few pages, and yeah, it's okay. You can see the influences. It's very Game of Thrones, but he's actually done really well. He sold well over 3,000 copies in hardcover, which is amazing. And I asked him how he did that, and he did that through reaching out to the gaming community, which I thought was a really good way of doing it. Because if you self-publish a book, you've got to try and sell it, because nobody else is going to try and sell it for you. So well done to Jude for that. Amazing. So if you want to watch that interview a few weeks back, it's quite interesting because he talked about his experiences with major publishers in trying to get that sort of book, a grimdark sort of book, through the portals and into mainstream publishing at the moment. Anyway, something completely different. I don't really read crime fiction anymore. I've had 2 major periods of reading crime fiction, one from about 86 to about 93, and then I got back into it in about 2011, and for about 10-12 years I read lots of crime fiction. I particularly like American and European crime fiction. I'm not big on the body in the library, none of that cozy stuff. And I read a crime novel a while ago because it was a comeback from Jake Arnett. This is Blood Rifle. Now Jake he's not really a crime writer. Some of his novels could be classified as crime writing. What he's really good at is capturing the zeitgeist of particular times. He broke through in the late 90s with a book called The Long Firm, which was a crime narrative told in about 5 different voices, reminiscent of the days of the Cray twins and the Richardsons. Really, really good book. It was made into a TV series. Heck of a nice guy. We've met a couple of times. We did an event together 7-8 years ago. Really, really good guy. Wrote an amazing uncategorizable novel called House of Rumour, which I think is SF, and it's one of my favourite SF novels this century. But he hadn't done anything for a while, and I think Jake lost his deal with Hodder and Stoughton, his major publisher, who made a mess themselves by putting terrible jackets on his books. And this is published by Datura, who incidentally have also published a crime novel a couple of years ago by Adam Roberts. So there you go. And this really is a retelling of one of Sophocles' Theban plays. I'm not going to tell you which one because it'll be obvious once you start reading. And it's transported to contemporary Essex, so it's small-time gangsters. So you can see this as a TV series, and even though it's not Jake's finest achievement in a literary sense. The way he takes the idea, which is common now, of classical retellings, which loads and loads of female writers are doing, trying to foreground the female characters, who've always been foregrounded in Greek mythology anyway, and in Greek literature. Arnott does this really, really brilliant, fantastic stuff, and I ate it up in for 2 or 3 sittings, loved it. You will find it's hard to find in the shops. It doesn't have a big profile out there. If you want to read a good contemporary grit Brit thriller, this is more like Ted Lewis, Anthony Frewin, Derek Raymond, those sort of things, home counties, and I loved it. It was really, really good. Good on you, Jake. It's good to see you back, and it's a paperback original. Hopefully we will see Jake doing something more avant-garde next time, fingers crossed, but lovely, lovely fun read. Really enjoyed it. An author I really like, who has kept me entertained this year, as he always does, with his mixture of the witty, the weird, and his left field grittiness, is the very wonderful Nicholas Royle. And Nicholas Royle is a short story writer, editor, novelist. Isn't a novel about 7 years? His first novel, which was about 6th or 7th novel, is brilliant. Do pick it up. And I read this earlier novel, Matter of the Heart, which is really, really good. Really enjoyed that. Has SF elements. And more recently from Nicholas, his Paris Fantastique. There's only 500 of these printed. Try and pick it up because they won't be out there very long. And of course, he did those wonderful books about book collecting, White Spines and Confessions of a Book Collector. Just great stuff, absolutely great stuff. And I'm looking forward to Nicholas's next book next year. He's reliable, and he's a man who foams at the mouth with his love of writing and reading and book collecting. I can't say enough good about him, so he's a joy as ever. What else do we have? Somebody I started reading a couple of years ago, and I'm gradually making my way through his oeuvre. And I do have mixed feelings about it, because sometimes I think he's really good. He is repetitious. He's no longer with us again, sadly, is Joel Lane. This is The Terrible Changes, and this is The Earthwire. And these are 2 short story collections, which I haven't read yet. I've read other things by Joel this year, and they've been issued by the very wonderful Influx Press, which is run by a writer called Gary Budden. I really, really like Gary's works. I read his novel and his short story collection last year, and I called the video my new favourite writer, and I do wish Gary would do more, because I think he does fantastic work, really good. And these are urban weird fiction in the manner of, say, M. John Harrison or Nicholas Royle, usually set in Birmingham. They were mostly published in anthologies, small magazines, what have you. He won the World Fantasy Award at one point. And in a way, I like them, but you can have too much of a good thing, and I wish I'd spaced them out a bit more. He does have his shtick. He has his riffs, his ticks, what have you. He's a cut above most writers of this kind. I would far prefer him to Ramsey Campbell, for example. He's not as good as M. John, and he's not as good as Royle at his best. He was also gay, I think, or at least he had a fixation on gay characters. I'm not entirely certain. And sometimes, that's absolutely fine, but that sort of focus in his work naturally lends itself more to a gay reader than a straight reader. But as you will have seen from my videos earlier in the year, I did a video about John Resch. Who's one of my favourite writers, and he's gay, and his work is predominantly about that aspect of American life in the 60s and 70s. But I'm going to read these and let you know what I think. I don't read a lot of horror fiction or weird fiction these days. I like it when I'm in the mood. What am I in the mood for? What I'm mostly in the mood for, quite honestly, is the mainstream and the slipstream, and that's where we're going to go in a moment. Music books, as I said, I was into music a lot earlier this year, and the 2 best music books I read this year were 3 Shades of Blue by James Kaplan, which is fantastic. It might have been the end of last year, actually, I read it. It's about Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and the Lost Empire of Cool. If you are getting into modern jazz, and of course modern jazz is sort of mid-50s until about the mid-60s, give this a go, because this is the only book I've read that pulls together the work of Davis, Coltrane, Bill Evans, also Cannonball Adderley's mentioned in here, Charles Mingus. Really, really great book. If you are into jazz or getting into jazz, give it a go. It's a fantastic read, and it's an easy read. Probably my music book of the last couple of years. Really great stuff. I have, of course, also had my big Beatles phase this year, not because I never acknowledged that they were good. I used to think that their importance was overstated. I am fascinated by the narrative and their impact. And this year I read this book, which won the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction about 4 or 5 years ago, which is a huge bestseller. And I really enjoyed this. This is 1, 2, 3, 4 by Craig Brown. You will have seen this around everywhere a few years ago. And it's a kind of non-linear biography of the Beatles. It even has a science fiction element. There's one part where it's mostly small and episodic. There's sections which are 2 or 3 pages long. There's one part where there's an alternative history story. It doesn't tell you that, you just have to discover it and read it, where the Beatles don't become stars, but Jerry and the Pacemakers do instead. And it's really, really good. And it begins and ends with exactly the same piece of writing. It has a great piece of prose about Brian Epstein going down the steps of the cavern to hear the Beatles for the first time, and it ends with the same piece. So it's not a conventional biography, but it's super readable. And even if you don't like the Beatles, but you understand their cultural importance and how they came at that point and music was changed afterwards, this is really, really great read. Really recommend it. If you've got somebody who's a Beatles fan in your family and they haven't read this, buy it for them for Christmas. It's really great. So you'll notice I've been using the term the slipstream increasingly, and a while ago I did a video about Slipstream. And Slipstream is basically the science fiction which is not published, marketed and packaged as science fiction. It's published, marketed and packaged as general fiction, and it's always been there, because of course there was a time when there was no science fiction. The word science fiction didn't exist till 2026. Science fiction's 100 years old next year, genre science fiction. So there was a point where all proto-SF and scientific romance, from Mary Shelley to Wells up till 1926, was in the slipstream. The slipstream still exists. Look at Margaret Atwood, for example. She's not a genre SF writer. She's not a science fiction writer. She's a writer of general fiction who's written a little bit of SF, which has been packaged as mainstream literature and has done really well. I've always read in the slipstream, and I've become increasingly attracted to it because I think that's where the action is. And probably the best pure slipstream book I've read this year, one which has the best claim to be science fiction, is The Expansion Project by Ben Pester. I did exchange a couple of emails with Ben a little while ago, a really nice guy. And this was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. Now the Goldsmiths Prize is the prize which is about, it's handed to somebody who's written a novel which expands the possibilities of the novel form. M. John Harrison won it a few years ago. He just missed out. The winner will be reviewed on the channel next year. It's very slender. It's published by Granta. Really, really good. He's done a book of short stories which I haven't read. And this is about a guy who works for this mysterious company who are engaged upon an expansion project. And he takes his young daughter to work on Take Your Young Daughter to Work Day. Then she goes missing, and then he realizes that maybe she was never there. And the expansion project itself is very mysterious. It's hard to tell whether it's something real. It's probably something virtual, and it's very surreal and very strange. It makes comments about work particularly, and about bureaucracy, but also about the thinning of the line, that liminal space between what is real and what is virtual, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very compassionate, wise, it's funny at times, it's challenging, but it is very reasonable, and great, great characterization. Well done, Ben. I wish you'd won the Goldsmiths, but that's the thing with prizes. Often the best writer doesn't win them, so we'll see, we'll see. So I'm just checking my microphone. Also, really, really good. I read her first book, which is a short story collection a few years ago, and mentioned it briefly in a Two Grumpy Old Men video with my friend Graham Bray, is the wonderful Kate Folk. And this is her first full-length novel, Sky Daddy, which does for commercial aircraft what J.G. Ballard did for automobiles in Crash. And it's incredibly funny. Really, really good. But she does something different. I initially thought, oh, she's just doing a Crash thing. And it's definitely there, because it's the narrative of a young American woman who is erotically obsessed with commercial airlines. Very, very funny. This was this year's Atessa Moshfegh for me. I do like the way a lot of young female writers are being more visceral and intelligent, and not shying away from the gritty sort of, you know, the fleshy parts of life. And this was so funny, so entertaining, and a cult book in the making. It really doesn't pull any punches. Brilliant characterization, and I absolutely loved it. So if you'd said to me, this woman will come along, she will do a take on the ballad and would go her own way with it, and she'll make a success, I'd have gone, ugh. But I gave it a try, and I'm glad I did, because it was fantastic. One of my books of the year, alongside Ben Peston. Then another great book, and this one and the two before are all covered in more depth in a video I made called 3 Cutting Edge Novels a few months ago. The Return of Nina Allen. Nina is a really good British science fiction, weird fiction writer. The last few years, she just goes off on these tangents. She does what she likes. You can't predict what she's going to do. The Guardian said that she was one of the 50 writers in the UK to watch. Now, she's a great lady. I first met her way back, at least 15 years ago, probably longer actually. And we have done bookshop events together. I've seen her for a while. She married Christopher Priest and has been finishing off the biography of Ballard that he was working on, The Illuminated Man, and that will come out early next year. That'll be covered on the channel. She came back with a book I consider her best book for many years, and that's A Granite Silence, which is a crime novel, but it's not a genre crime novel. It's a novel about an actual true crime. A lot of the things in this are real. There are one or two things which are made up. It has nods towards science fiction in one part. And Nina is somebody who really could go up for the Goldsmiths, because in this she's doing something I've not really seen in any other book. It reminded me of when Truman Capote did Music for Chameleons, which is a book that has short stories that read like journalistic essays and essays that read like journalistic short stories. So she's in that ballpark, and it was really refreshing. Very human book, because it's about the murder of a little girl in a Aberdeen tenement back in the 1930s. And loads of researchers, she puts herself into it, she pulls herself out of it, and it really does blur the line between, I guess you could call it faction. I don't like that word, but it is entirely applicable to this. Absolute classic, both of true crime and crime fiction, but not genre crime. It's going to be commercially a really hard book to place in paperback, because the average British crime reader won't go near it. It'll probably get lost in the cracks, a bit in like the way that Jeff Noom's fantastic crime novel Slow Motion Ghosts did. That was a great one as well. But pick it up and read it. It's really good. She's had a lot of support from Scottish booksellers and in Scotland, which is really good. She lives on the Isle of Bute, interestingly enough. Great lady. And as I say, we'll be covering The Illuminated Man, the Ballard Priest biography, next year on the channel. Fantastic stuff. One of my best books I read this year. Okay, then. It's always a delight to reconnect with old friends. And last year, you will have seen on the channel, I went over to Paris for a few days and I met up with Michael Morcock, did an interview. And Mike and I have known each other since the late 80s. We did some book events together back in the 80s and 90s. And we lost touch. We would occasionally be in touch on social media, but we got back together and we had a chat and it was great. And Mike produced this wonderful collaboration with Mark Hodder, The Albino Secret, which is a return to the world of Seton Beg, who is his Eternal Champion style variant on Sexton Blake, and the marvellous Zenith the Albino, the ultra villain created by Anthony Skene for Sexton Blake thrillers way back in the 1920s, who Morcock invoked in The Metatemporal Detective from 2007. Wonderful book. And this is a rip-roaring Indiana Jones type tale, with the references that you'd expect to all the other books. The Von Becks pop up in here. There's hints of Elric and Jerry Cornelius. Zenith himself, the albino crook, is in it. Absolutely marvellous stuff. And I really enjoyed this. And even though the pro style is more Mark Hodder's than Mike's, they've got another 2 of these coming, and they're working on a revised edition of The Metatemporal Detective. This was the most joyous and enjoyable and fun book I read this year, and it didn't insult my intelligence. I absolutely loved it. It was such fun, and it makes you realize that you can write popular fiction and make it intelligent and entertaining, and it intersects nicely with things like the Von Beck series. I say, absolutely marvelous. I loved this. Mike and Mark, please keep it up. Let's have the other ones. I loved it. This will be out in paperback next year. It's £25 hardcover. Get it for yourself for Christmas. It's really good fun, especially if you haven't read Morcock for a long time. You will love it. Then, what are the best books I read this year? Well, I would say they're books I've both read comparatively recently, and I I'm not going to say which one is the best, because they both affected me in different ways, and that's the thing. But they really got me responding emotionally and intellectually, and that's a really important thing. And somebody I really like is Michel Houellebecq, and this is The Map and the Territory, from 2010, which won the Prix Goncourt, France's preeminent literary award. And I started reading Houellebecq probably about, let's see, 10, 12 years ago, and I read his book about H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, which is the best book title ever. And it was good. I can't remember a lot about it. I should go back to it. And then I read his SF novel, Submission, which was fantastic. I had also read by that point The Possibility of an Island, which I felt was a bit mixed. But I read Submission, I read Serotonin when that came out. Last year, I read Annihilation, which was his new book that year, which was the best book I read last year. And this year, I read this, and this is absolutely sublime. This is the book which really lifted him up. Something I did was I went back and read his first 4 novels, his 5 novels, which came out before this. One of them was Possibility of an Island, so I reread that, and I read his first 4. And they all are rather fixated on sex tourism, and I don't want to talk about that at any great length because I've covered this a lot in the club room. But this was marvellous. This is about the life of an artist in Paris. And across his life, he has about 3 major art projects. And it begins with him at Christmas time. He's got to go and visit his dad. Absent fathers and difficult relationships between fathers and sons are a big thing in Houellebecq. And his boiler's on the, is knocking and is on the way out. But he does these 3 art projects and across his life. And gradually, when you get to the end of the book, you see the significance of them. And it does have a science fictional ending because it moves into the future beyond the date of this book. And the ending reminded me of both The Genocides by Thomas M. Dish and Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, while being a lot more subtle. There is something about man's relationship with nature in here. And I absolutely love this. I mean, formally, this is, in terms of structure, character, balance, ambition and quiet skill, this is easily the finest novel I read this year, and I'm sorry I left it so long. When reading the earlier novels, I found them very mixed. The obsession with sex tourism, which doesn't really come up in this, rather bothered me, even though in those first 5 novels, 3 of them are actually SF, so it was quite interesting. But I've now read all his work, and I'm eagerly awaiting his next book. It'll probably be a few years yet. He is the bad boy of French literature. I think he's often very misunderstood. He can be nihilistic. He's somebody who really understands what it's like to be getting older. He's somebody who understands the economics of sex, which is a big thing in his world, how some people are doomed to loneliness, some will be profligate and will be very lucky that way, and he's really good on that subject. But The Map and the Territory, if you want to start reading him, I'd say start reading this. This is absolutely magnificent book, and I'm sorry I left it so long. But part of the beauty of not keeping up is that the furore and excitement about books of Stuart Dewell dies down, and then you can be more objective about them, be more yourself. You don't feel the world looking over your shoulder, and you don't have the urge to bite the hand that says, no, I'm not going to agree this is great, or yes, I am going to agree. You can be more objective and more measured and immerse yourself into it more. As this is a science fiction channel, I'm going to end with a book which I feel is deeply ambiguous, because I think the nature of SF now should tend towards ambiguity. And this is a weird one because it's a book about science, but it's not really a science fiction novel, but it performs the same function. And as I'm always saying on this channel, if SF has a function, it is to do what Whitehead said, which is it is the business of the future to be dangerous. This is The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut. Terrible cover, dreadful, awful, and I've broken the spine. And I don't do that with books, but this affected me so much that a kind of fever caught hold of me. And I have covered this on the channel already, probably in the club room, I think, and I read another book by him. He's Dutch. He moved to South America when he's quite young. He grew up in Chile, lives in Santiago, and this is sublime. It is a biographical novel about John von Neumann, who was a Hungarian mathematician. He got involved with all sorts of things in maths and physics before the war. A very strange, obsessed character. He was involved with the Manhattan Project in America, lived in the States, and he worked on a computer called the Maniac. And he basically was the person who came up with the idea of AI being self-replicating and inventing new AIs and what have you. And it's absolutely terrifying. And the implications of what von Neumann does, and this is Labatat's thing. He writes about how scientists, these feverish figures in maths and physics, these mavericks who've discovered quantum theory and those sort of things, how they go ahead and they create things and they don't think about the implications for humanity. Von Neumann did, but he didn't think it was that important. And I got really caught up in Labatat's prose style. He is a guy who is clearly a polemical novelist, and he's very, very concerned about where science is taking us, and I think he's right. The amazing thing about this book is that it gets to a coda sequence, which is, let's see, how many pages? It's not paginated. You're 270 pages into the book. John von Neumann has died, and there's that much of it left. And he covers, in stunning depth and with wonderful telling characterization, the research he's done is amazing, a game of Go played between a Korean Go master and AlphaGo, a artificial intelligence created by DeepMind. And you can actually, there's a video about this. There's a full-blown documentary about it on, I think it's on Prime on Netflix, and there's lots of videos on YouTube about it, and about how this Go master goes up against this AI. And it's absolutely gripping. It's the most gripping thing I've read this year. And what this book did for me, it delivered for me the kind of excitement that I wanted from science fiction, the kind of intellectual stimulation that I haven't always been getting from genre SF. There really isn't any need, when there's books like this being written about now and the near future, to go off on these flights of fantasy and space opera and what have you. That, sadly, these days is pretty much just escapism. This is where the real cutting edge is in the Slipstream. And even though it's not a science fiction novel, it shows how the mainstream novel and the science fiction novel have converged, and how you cannot write truly great contemporary general literary fiction without acknowledging SF and building it into what you do. And Labatat has done this amazingly well. When I read his previous book, which is called When We Cease to Understand the World, it made me feel very, very unpleasant indeed, even though it was stunningly well written, because he just alerts you to the fact that a lot of these people doing these things, they weren't like the rest of us, and they're slightly fictionalized, but his research is impeccable, and the feverishness of their ideas just overtook them, and it's clearly terrified Labatat, and it terrified me as well. And it is the business of the future to be dangerous. So that's probably the books which I enjoyed the most this year. So as you see, there's not a lot of A format genre SF in there. I've moved away from that a lot. It has made me question, in the time I've got left on planet Earth, how much more routine genre SF I'm going to read. I'm not going to read much new stuff. I will pick things up and have a go at them, see what they're like. And really, it has come back to me, the criticism that people often make of genre SF, that it's not very well written. And the fact is, a lot of it isn't. You know, as I say, there's stuff in the mainstream that's not well written, but if you pick the right stuff, where novelists have really worked at it, and that's what I'd always hoped to see more of in genre SF. And we got it in Ballard, in Priest, in M. John, in Morcock, in some of his less popular work. It's there in people like Adam Roberts, Dave Hutchinson, you know, there's flashes of it there, Jeff Ryman, these sort of people. And, you know, we just need more of it. We just need more really good writing. Unfortunately, commercially, we're not at that period. So that's my books of the year. I've talked far longer than I intended to. Hope you enjoyed that. So if you can like, subscribe, comment, and if you want to join the club room, it says $4.99 a month. And who knows what tomorrow will bring. There will be some more videos before the end of the year. January, there'll be clubroom videos. I'm taking a 2-week holiday. I'm hoping to get away somewhere. And there will probably be less activity then, and we'll be back to normal in February. Thanks to everybody who's watched the videos, commented, subscribed, what have you. And again, if you joined the clubroom, thanks a lot. And, you know, it's interesting to see, you know, tell me what you've enjoyed the most this year. And particularly, I'd like to know, in the inverse of this video, what books published this year you've really enjoyed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.